When Richard and Lisa Harper bought the house in Benedict Hills, they knew they were stepping into a piece of Hollywood history. The sprawling 1948 estate, once home to the legendary James Caan, had been well-maintained despite its age. They weren't the first to own it after Caan, but something about the house still carried his presence at least. That's what the real estate agent had joked about. Lisa loved the property from the start. The exposed beam ceilings, the warm hardwood floors, the perfect amount of old Hollywood charm. Richard, a real estate investor, was more practical. "It's a good deal," he had said. "We'll renovate it, enjoy it for a few years, then flip it." But even on their first night, Lisa felt something off. Not eerie exactly, but unsettled. The house had a weight to it, a strange energy she couldn't place. The rooms were silent, yet she always had the sense that something was listening. Then there were the doors. At first, it was just the bedroom closet. Lisa swore she closed it before bed, but every morning it would be slightly ajar. Then the pantry. Then the door to James Caan's old study, which had been locked when they moved in. One morning, they found it wide open. "Rich, did you open this?" Lisa asked, her voice tight. Richard frowned. "I didn't even know it could open. We don't have the key." The house had plenty of corks, old pipes groaning at night, the faint scent of cigar smoke that would sometimes linger in the hallway, but they dismissed it all as part of the home's character. Until the night Richard saw him. The night Richard saw him, the house was quiet. Too quiet. It was late past 2 in the morning when he woke to the sound of something faint, a soft shuffle like fabric dragging against wood. He blinked against the darkness, his mind still heavy with sleep. Lisa lay beside him, her breathing slow, undisturbed. Richard wasn't the type to believe in ghosts. He was a man of numbers, of investments and returns, of things that could be quantified and controlled. But something about the house had begun to gnaw at him, a feeling just beneath the surface of logic, like a whisper in the dark that couldn't be silenced. He sat up, listening. There it was again. A step, then another. A deliberate, measured pace moving down the hallway outside their bedroom. Not the house settling. Not the wind. Person. Richard slid out of bed, moving carefully so as not to wake Lisa. His pulse was steady, but his body was tense. He wasn't afraid. Not yet. The hallway was dimly lit by the glow of the moon filtering in through the large window at the end of the corridor. The walls, painted a soft cream, seemed colder in the faint light, the framed black and white photographs casting elongated shadows that stretched like reaching fingers. And then he saw him. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, just beyond the window. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in what Richard's mind first registered as a suit, no, a blazer, something casual yet unmistakably old-fashioned. His features were obscured by the darkness, but Richard could see the slight tilt of his head, the way he stood with his hands in his pockets, relaxed, observing. For a moment, neither of them moved. Richard's breath came slow and measured, his heartbeat a dull thud in his ears. His mind scrambled for explanations. Was someone in the house? Had they been broken into? But there was no sound of forced entry, no shattered glass, no hurried footsteps, just the man. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure turned. Not abruptly, not in alarm, just a smooth, effortless pivot, as if he were strolling through his own home. And as he moved, he faded. Not into the shadows, not into another room. He simply ceased to be. Richard stood frozen. He could still feel the presence in the air, the way the space had shifted around it. It was like an echo that hadn't quite faded. When he finally found the nerve to move, he walked slowly toward the spot where the figure had stood. The wooden floor was smooth beneath his bare feet, the air still carrying the faintest trace of something. Tobacco, aged leather, the kind of scent that lingered in places long after a person had left. Richard exhaled sharply and turned back toward the bedroom, shaking his head. Maybe he was tired. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe he had imagined the whole thing. But when he climbed back into bed, Lisa stirred beside him, her voice thick with sleep. "Who were you talking to?" He stared at the ceiling. "No one," he said. He wasn't sure if he believed it. The study had been locked since they moved in. Richard hadn't questioned it at first. The house had passed through several owners, and it wasn't unusual for some rooms to be sealed off, forgotten, or simply ignored. But after that night, after the man in the hallway, he found himself standing in front of that door more and more often, his fingers brushing against the brass handle, his mind turning over questions he couldn't quite articulate. It was an old door, the wood worn around the edges, as if countless hands had opened it before. The keyhole, a small, unassuming thing, stared back at him like an unblinking eye. He had tried a few keys they found in a kitchen drawer, but none had fit. Lisa, half amused, half annoyed, had told him to let it go. "It's probably just storage," she had said. "A bunch of junk someone left behind." Richard wasn't so sure anymore. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in soft, golden light, he decided to force it open. The air inside was different, stale, undisturbed. The scent of old paper and leather-bound books filled the space, mingling with something subtler, a hint of cigar smoke, faint but unmistakable. Dust clung to the heavy curtains, their folds untouched for years. Against one wall stood a large mahogany desk, the kind built to last a lifetime, its surface still covered with scattered papers, as if their owner had only stepped away for a moment. Richard hesitated at the threshold, his fingers tightening around the doorknob. He had expected the room to be empty, forgotten, but it wasn't. Everything was as it had been. The chair, slightly pulled back, as though someone had just risen from it. A glass on the desk, the rim lined with the ghost of an old stain. The bookshelves, towering and filled with volumes whose spines gleamed in the dim light, untouched by time. It was as if James Caan had never left. Richard stepped inside, his movements careful, almost reverent. The weight of the air pressed down on him, thick with something he couldn't quite name. He reached for one of the papers on the desk, an old script, yellowed at the edges. The title, scrawled in black ink, was familiar, one of Caan's lesser-known films. But it wasn't the title that made Richard's breath catch. It was the note written in the margin. A single line, hastily scribbled, the ink smudged as if the pen had been dragged across the paper in urgency. "Don't let them in." The words sent a slow chill down his spine. His fingers hovered over the paper, tracing the letters, feeling the indentation left behind by the pressure of the pen. The warning was old, but it felt immediate, present, as though it had been meant for him. A creak echoed through the room. Not the house settling, not the wind, something heavier, closer. Richard turned slowly, his breath caught in his throat. The door, it was closing, not slamming, not swinging shut with a gust of air. It was moving deliberately, as if guided by an unseen hand. Richard lunged, his pulse hammering, his fingers wrapping around the doorknob just before it clicked into place. The moment he touched it, the room shifted. The temperature dropped, a sharp, biting cold wrapping around him like a vice. The scent of cigar smoke thickened, curling through the air. No longer a faint remnant, but something fresh, something present. And then, a whisper, low, gravelly, just behind him. "Too late." Richard wrenched the door open and stumbled back into the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The study remained dark behind him, but the presence, that heavy, pressing feeling, lingered. The house was watching, and it wasn't done with him yet. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Richard barely slept that night. Even as he lay beside Lisa, his body exhausted but his mind unwilling to rest, he could still feel the weight of the study pressing against him. He could still hear the whisper, low and rasping, curling around his ear like breath against his skin. Too late. The words looped in his mind, fraying at the edges of reason. He had never believed in ghosts. Not really. But there was no rational way to explain what had happened in that room, the way the air had thickened, the way the door had moved controlled. The warning on the script still burned behind his eyes. He stared at the ceiling, tracking the faint patterns of shadows cast by the streetlights outside. The house creaked around him, old wood shifting against itself, the kind of noises he had dismissed when they first moved in. Now each one felt deliberate, like something unseen was moving just beyond his vision. At some point, exhaustion won. His eyelids grew heavy, his thoughts sluggish. He let himself drift. And then he was standing in the hallway. The dream, if it was a dream, felt too solid, too real. The hardwood was cool beneath his bare feet, the air thick with that familiar scent of old paper and smoke. The corridor stretched long and empty, the walls bathed in dim, wavering light. The air carried a hum, a faint vibration that he could feel in his ribs, like the house itself was breathing. He turned his head. At the end of the hall, the study door stood open. No, not again. But his feet moved on their own. Slow, measured steps, drawn forward as if something invisible had hooked itself into his spine, reeling him in. The darkness inside the room was deeper than it should have been. It pooled thick in the corners, swallowed the edges of the furniture. He could just make out the desk, the bookshelves, the chair still slightly pulled back, still waiting. But the mirror. He hadn't noticed the mirror before. It stood against the far wall, taller than him, its ornate wooden frame carved with intricate, swirling designs. The glass was old, cloudy around the edges, its surface catching only faint glimmers of light. Richard's breath hitched. Something was in it. At first, it was just a shadow, a smudge of darkness that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at it. He took a step closer and the shape began to sharpen. A man, tall, broad-shouldered. Richard's reflection remained frozen, his body unmoving. But the figure in the mirror shifted. It wasn't him. It was someone else. His throat tightened, breath lodged in his chest. The man in the glass stood with his hands in his pockets. His posture relaxed, casual, but there was something wrong with his face. The features blurred and flickered, never quite settling into something solid. For a moment, Richard thought he saw the ghost of a smirk, something knowing, something mocking. And then the figure took a step forward. Not in the room, in the glass. Richard stumbled back, his arms knocking into the desk behind him. His reflection remained still, locked in place, but the man in the mirror kept coming. Closer. The cigar smoke in the room thickened. The air seemed to fold in on itself, the floor tilting slightly beneath his feet, as if the house had shifted, as if reality itself was bending under an unseen weight. A whisper slithered through the air, threading through the walls, through the wood and the dust, curling around him like invisible fingers. You let them in. The figure in the mirror reached the surface of the glass and pressed his hand against it. The mirror shuddered. The wood groaned. The glass rippled as if it were water disturbed by a slow-moving hand. Richard bolted. He didn't look back, didn't wait to see what happened next. His body moved before his mind could catch up, his feet slamming against the floor as he tore down the hallway, shoving open the bedroom door with enough force to rattle the hinges. Lisa jolted upright, her eyes wide with groggy confusion. Richard? What the hell? The mirror, he panted. His hands braced against the doorframe. The study someone's. He cut himself off. The hallway behind him was empty. The air was still. No shifting shadows. No whispering voice. No lingering scent of cigar smoke. The door to the study was closed. Lisa rubbed her eyes, sighing. Babe, what's going on? Richard swallowed, his throat dry, his hands trembling. He had felt it. He knew what he had seen. But the house was silent now. The only sound was Lisa's steady breathing, and his own pulse roaring in his ears. The days that followed should have been normal. The sun rose, spilling warm gold over the Benedict Hills, filling the house with soft light that should have erased the night's shadows. The streets bustled as they always had, neighbors walking their dogs, delivery trucks rumbling past, life continuing as if nothing had changed. But for Richard, nothing was normal. The study door remained shut. He never touched it again. Not because he believed it was locked, but because something inside him, something instinctual, primal, told him that opening it a second time would be worse. The air in the house felt different, heavier, as if something unseen had settled into its bones. And then there was the mirror. Richard avoided looking into it. Any mirror. The reflection from his shaving glass in the bathroom, the hallway's decorative piece near the front door, even the dark screen of the TV at night. Each time he caught his own face in the glass, he hesitated. He watched, waiting, unsure if the man he saw staring back was really him. Lisa noticed the change. "You're not sleeping," she said one evening, watching him over her wine glass. "I'm fine," Richard muttered. She set the glass down with a quiet clink. "You're not. You keep flinching at nothing. You don't talk. You don't even—" She stopped, exhaling, pressing her fingers into her temples. "Is it the house? Do you regret buying it?" "Yes." "No." He didn't know. I feel like something's wrong," he admitted, the words tasting strange on his tongue. He wasn't used to saying things like that out loud. Lisa studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're working too much. Stress does things to your mind, Rich. Maybe we should get away for a bit." Richard wanted to tell her she was right, that it was just stress, but he couldn't force the lie past his lips, because that night, when he got up to use the bathroom, he heard footsteps that weren't his own. Soft, measured, coming from the hallway. He stopped with his hand on the bathroom door, breath caught in his throat. The air was still, thick with silence. He turned his head just slightly, enough to see the shadows stretching out across the hardwood floor. And then, in the dimness, a reflection, the hallway mirror. Richard saw his own back in the glass. The way he stood, frozen, barely breathing. The soft glow from the nightlight near the stairs gave just enough illumination for him to see the space behind him. Empty. But in the reflection, someone stood in the hallway. Tall, broad-shouldered. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the light. A man. Standing right behind him. Richard spun. The hallway was empty. He turned back to the mirror. The man was still there. Closer now. His heart slammed against his ribs. The breath he exhaled fogged the glass, just slightly. His reflection should have been the same. It wasn't. His own mirrored self wasn't breathing. The man in the mirror stood just behind his reflection, his face partially obscured by the dimness. But Richard saw enough. The hard set of his jaw, the casual, relaxed stance, the hint of something in his eyes, something Richard couldn't place but somehow felt deep in his gut. The man in the mirror tilted his head. And then, he smiled. A slow, knowing curve of the lips. Richard staggered back, the heel of his foot catching against the floor. The moment his eyes darted away, just for a fraction of a second, the mirror went dark. No figure. No reflection at all. The glass stared back at him, empty. A whisper brushed his ear. "You should have left." Richard's entire body went cold. And then footsteps. But this time they were real. Not in the hallway. Not inside the house. On the roof. A slow, steady rhythm. A presence moving above them, deliberate, measured. One step. Then another. Lisa stirred in the bedroom. "Richard." He didn't answer. His pulse thundered. He could still feel the presence of the man behind the glass. He could still feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from the study. Something was inside the house. Something was on the house. And the warning, scrawled in hurried handwriting across the script in the study, burned itself into his mind once more. Don't let them in. But it was too late. They were already here. The footsteps on the roof stopped. Silence pressed against the walls of the house, heavy and expectant. Richard stood frozen, his breath shallow, his heart a violent drumbeat in his ears. He didn't dare look at the mirror again. Then, a sound. Not footsteps. Not a whisper. A knock. From inside the walls. Lisa stirred, sitting up in bed. What was that? Richard didn't answer. He moved toward the bedroom window, hands shaking as he pulled back the curtain. The night outside was still. The city below stretched out in glittering lights. The roof should have been empty, but it wasn't. A figure stood just beyond the eaves. Dark. Waiting. Watching him. The features were indistinct, swallowed by the shadows. But the shape, the broad shoulders, the tilt of the head was unmistakable. The man from the mirror. Lisa's voice wavered behind him. Richard. The figure moved. Not toward the edge. Not toward the house. Toward the window. Richard yanked the curtain shut, stepping back, panic clawing up his throat. He grabbed Lisa's arm. Get up. Get dressed. We're leaving. Now. Lisa looked at him like he was insane. What? Richard. What the hell is going on? A deep creak echoed through the house. The sound of something heavy shifting, settling, as if the very walls were breathing. The air thickened, the unseen weight pressing against Richard's chest. And then, a voice. Low, calm, amused. You let me in. The bedroom door swung open on its own. Lisa screamed. Richard grabbed her wrist and ran. They never looked back. The house remained behind them, dark and waiting. By morning, they were gone. By evening, the house was silent again, waiting for the next ones to arrive. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.